looking at the biology faculty. But I think more importantly, he produces really great individuals, the students. He's a great teacher. And tonight he's going to introduce you to some of his great students. I think he will handle the question and answers program after the presentation. And you can usually find that if you have an iPad by going to the far upper right-hand corner where it says more and tapping on that, and you'll find a chat button. For those of you with a computer, I think you'll find it on the bottom right-hand side of your computer. But I think without stumbling anymore, I want to introduce Dr. David Craig.
Thank you. It's great, great as always to connect to the Audubon folks, and it's an extraordinary job I get to be at Willamette University and meet so many early career professionals and creative people that I get to learn from them in this process called research. And for those who are curious about what's going on in the background of my office here, I've got my Black Lives Matter bald eagle, and my intersectional raised hand of sort of all kinds of different solidarity with different bird watchers and backgrounds. And then this is Kalapuyan land, acknowledging that we're in the space of the Kalapuya people who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Silex. And when we appreciate the birds in the Willamette Valley, we're continuing a type of appreciation that those families have done for time immemorial. The particular notation of that sign is from a Five Oaks museum exhibit that I recommend everybody go check out online, so you can learn more about some of the history of the Willamette Valley. Thinking about the way bird watching relates to topics that aren't bird watching is a really important part of my job, and because it's one of the ways in which interdisciplinary studies and the liberal arts tradition of American Academy in places like Willamette University is one of the things we do well, and we experiment with the way that we communicate and what we do. I use he, him pronouns, and I'll introduce each of the speakers today. Each of them have worked with me on a variety of different projects, and they're going to just highlight one project today. The general arc of our storyline today is we're going to start with Maddy Specht, and they're going to talk about some connections between birds and oak galls, and it's a question both of behavior and diet. Then we'll move to Blake Carlisle, who will talk about very specific questions about diet and white-breasted nuthatches and our local slender-billed subspecies. Caden Cantrell will follow with expansion on the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch with interest in nesting, and is going to tell a story of an extraordinary nest that we found. And then Patrick Livingston will finish with interest in nesting in American Kestrels, the keynote bird for the Salem Audubon's newsletter. So that's our storyline. These talks, one of the things I've loved about the long-term relationship between Willamette and Audubon is, for many folks, it's their very first talk they ever give outside of a classroom. And that's not the case for this group, but you've contributed greatly to the personal growth of many, many folks. This set of talks is a kind of a warm-up practice talk. Everybody's going to be presenting in tomorrow at Willamette Student Scholarship Recognition Day. I put a link in there for everybody. If you wanted to see these people talking in person, they'll be doing so tomorrow at Willamette. They're going to give a similar version of their talk, but a little more nerdy with more emphasis on the graphs and some of the details. And then there's all kinds of other talks around the entire academy, sort of all things tomorrow. With that, I will invite Maddy to introduce themselves and bring in their slides. I will say, although I have no favorites among this for some, Maddy's last name does mean woodpecker in German, and so that's pretty awesome. And I just can't help but sharing that. So Maddy, thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maddy Specht. I'm a junior at Willamette University, and today I will be talking to you about bird usage of stem oak galls on Oregon white oaks. So Oregon white oaks are arguably one of the most important trees in the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley used to be comprised of a beautiful oak savanna that sadly now only about 3% of that remains. These oaks benefit hundreds of species, one of these being the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch, which you can see right here. And these oaks can be used as a source of shelter or food. And these nuthatches here, for example, nest within the cavities of the tree. Another species that benefits greatly from these trees are oak gall wasps. Now, these oak gall wasps induce these tumor-like growths called galls, which then can develop and be used to hold wasp larvae until they are fully grown and can exit out of the gall. Within the gall, there are these larval chamber complex structures, which have locules within them, a ranging amount. They can either be unilocular or multilocular. And these locules are what house those larvae and would be considered the main target of predators. The structure of galls is proposed to have a variety of functions, one of the main ones being to protect the developing larvae on the inside from external predators, and this is called the enemy hypothesis. So these predators include invertebrates such as parasitoid wasps and vertebrates such as squirrels and birds. So from collecting galls in past projects, visible predation, like pictured here, has been found, but little evidence of what is causing this damage has been identified within the oak gall system. So these are just two examples of types of predation, most likely down in this bottom left. It is most likely caused by a downy woodpecker pecking into the gall, while this top right we believe to be a squirrel or something else with teeth that would have an easier time getting into the gall and making a hole that big. So in New York, a study was done on a different gall system entirely called the goldenrod gall, which was found to be highly used as a food source for downy woodpeckers in the spring and winter, and occasionally by black-capped chickadees as well. They observed that the downies would often leave a neat, tidy, round hole, while the chickadees would leave a larger asymmetrical hole due to their short bills. Preference for the goldenrod galls was selected through a lack of an exit hole, indicating that fly larvae was still inside, and it was noted that misshapen galls were actively avoided due to a higher likelihood of containing dead and immature fly larvae. So the goal of my research was to understand how downy woodpeckers and black-capped chickadees play a role within the stem oak gall system and to identify similar patterns like the ones seen in the goldenrod studies. So my methods just briefly included the first 4 gall collection, initial observations, measurements, and statistical tests were done in a previous research project in the fall of 2021 that was aimed at identifying how predatory pressure may affect gall formation, which further inspired looking into specific predators of stem oak galls, which then this semester I went more into literature review and camera trap analysis to better identify that. So gall samples came from 4 different sites with an abundance of Oregon white oaks, all within the Salem area, the main one being Bush Pasture Park, while the rest were found at Minto Brown Island Park, Pringle Park, as well as Willamette University. So 2 study sites that I used, the first one was outside of the Olin Science Center at Willamette. An old English oak branch had been hot glued with a bunch of stem galls of various sizes on a branch to simulate how they might naturally occur on an Oregon white oak. Data collection from this site was considered opportunistic and observational, and any galls that were removed from the tree with visible signs of predation were photo documented, which I will show you shortly. This simulated tree was observed for about a month and a half, which is beginning of March through mid-April, about today, and was mostly used as a perch for birds, and any galls with predation were mostly attacked by squirrels with what we noticed. So these are all the galls that I was able to successfully recover. This is only 10 of them. There was 36 total, but many of them were missing or unaccounted for, most likely due to the inclement weather we've been having, as well as possibly other animals or even human interference. Based off predation patterns, these were all most likely attacked by squirrels, but this one in the top left could definitely have the possibility of being attacked by a downy woodpecker. So my second study site was at the Delta Gamma House, also at Willamette University. We utilized the rooftop for this since there's a nice, beautiful Oregon oak that overhangs right on top with a natural branch that we attached 2 sets of galls that had been hot glued to branches with a wire and had a camera trap set up right next to it for 2 one-week periods to capture video of any movement that had occurred. And from this, 1,151 videos in total were retrieved from the camera trap, and each one was scrubbed through to determine if any birds or squirrels had made contact with the gulls to see if there was any interest. 0.2% of the videos resulted in birds making direct contact, 0.6% were squirrels, and a whopping 98% of it was just the branches blowing in the wind. There was 1.2% of the other videos encompassed human movement, animals in the background that didn't make any direct contact. And in a few cases, we had some birds trying to attack the camera trap, which was kind of funny. But this is a video of one of the squirrels making direct contact with the gull, taking a little nibble, and then scurrying off. And then this one on the bottom is just an example of the wind causing the camera trap to go off. So what does all of this mean? It was found that gull size does have a significant relationship with the type of predation. So selection for gull size, where the larger the gull diameter is, the higher the frequency of visible predation by vertebrates occurred. And also within the goldenrod gull system, there are some key differences from stem oak galls. For example, goldenrod galls develop fairly uniformly and are often much closer to the ground and on stalk-like plants, as you can see here, while stem oak galls, on the other hand, massively range in size and are often not perfectly round and more oblong, making it more difficult to determine larvae health and development from just observing the gall itself, as well as stem oak galls can range from being on baby developing oak saplings all the way to old growth oaks 20 feet in the air. So for the future, this research will be continued on into the summer, which is super exciting, and we can better understand the stem oak galls and the way birds fit within the system. We'd like to increase this gull sample size and preferably find galls lacking exit holes to be the main target of collection to better simulate preferential gull conditions when they are looking for a food resource. And then we'd also like a better understanding and more information on oak gull wasp phenology. That would greatly benefit this study since very little is known about their life cycle. So it's difficult to determine when gull larvae would be at their most mature stage and therefore a good research for birds. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Maddy. So the one thing that I'll just throw out there for all the Audubon folks is we're still trying to get the picture of the woodpeckers and squirrels interacting with those galls. So this is the call. Folks who want to do questions, you can put them in the chat or save them. I think we'll go through each of the talks and then do questions at the end. So write those down that you have for Maddy, and then we'll go forward. Blake, what can you share about your insights to things that we've learned about nuthatch diet?
Oops, okay, here we are. So my name is Blake. I'm a junior at Willamette University. I'm an environmental science major and a biology minor. And my project is titled Elucidating the Diet of the Slender-billed White-breasted Nuthatch. And the reason why it's called Elucidating the Diet of the Slender-billed White-breasted Nuthatch is because it is kind of a mystery that needs to be explained. So that is where we begin with mine. So to start things off, the species that we are looking at with this project is the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch. So the scientific name of this bird is Sitta carolinensis aculeata. And this is a subspecies of the very common feeder visitor, the white-breasted nuthatch. So this is a subspecies that lives in the Pacific Northwest and in a lot of areas in California as well. So generally, this is the white-breasted nuthatch subspecies that you will find on the West Coast. So this bird has been shown to have a long-term decline within the Pacific Northwest and especially within the Willamette Valley. And that's why we care so much about this bird. And what's interesting is that other subspecies that exist in the interior west of the United States or in the east areas, east coast and southwest, those subspecies are actually not declining at the same rate or at all. So this kind of gives the slender-billed nuthatch a bit more of a sensitive status. Another thing that we know is that this subspecies is dependent on mature large diameter oaks for nesting and foraging. And for this reason, it's considered an indicator species of that rare oak savanna, oak woodland habitat health in the Willamette Valley. So a little more on the ecological relationship with oaks, this bird. It's really something that is not very well understood. We know that they're very closely related to oak trees, especially the Oregon white oak, but biologists generally don't know very much about this relationship, both because the bird and its habitat remain understudied. But because this relationship is so strong, it's pretty clear that it must be understood to actually create effective management and recovery strategies. So in order to see an end to the decline of this bird, it's pretty critical that we understand its relationship to the oak and, therefore its habitat. So why the slender bill? Why is this subspecies called the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch? Well, let's start with a definition. Morphology is the physical form or structure of a living organism. So that includes all aspects. You could say the morphological aspects of the wings or the tail, or all kinds of things on this bird. But what we're primarily concerned with is the bill. So the slender bill. So the white-breasted nuthatch in this case has, the subspecies has a slimmer bill than the rest of the subspecies. And the morphology of bird bills can be influenced by a lot of things. But primarily what we're concerned with is diet and its relationship to habitat. So as you can see, the graphic underneath, so up here at the top is an image of the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch with a really clear view of its slender bill. And right underneath that, we have an example of, I believe these are Hawaiian birds, but basically what this is showing is how bird bills are adapted to their diet. So as you can see on the left here, nectar-sipping birds have a very specific bill morphology. Probing birds, which are looking for insects, have a curved, skinny bill, and the seed crushers on the right side here have very thick bills for crushing those seeds and ingesting them. So this is kind of like following in the footsteps of the Darwin's finches example of adaptive radiation in the Galapagos Islands. We're kind of applying the same principles to this nuthatch example and trying to figure out exactly what the slender bill means. So that leads us to some exploratory research questions. Like I just described, we have this unique morphology in the bill in comparison to other subspecies that exist elsewhere. Well, why is that? And what, in order to understand that, we want to know what the diet of this subspecies is. So how is it different from those other birds that don't have a slender? And as you can see here, I kind of have I have the nuthatch on the left here, and I have an example of different food items. And really, this is just kind of a general example here, but we have a little caterpillar, a beetle insect of some kind, and some seeds. And this is kind of just like a general kind of, these are the sort of categories that we know that it eats right now. But as far as specifics go, this is a bit of a question mark. So what we're left with, at the core of this project is the question of, does the diet of the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch explain its bill morphology and or its relationship to the Oregon white oak? So that's kind of just the culmination of what I've just described. So we want to find out the answer to these questions. Well, we have a few methods of assessing its diet. The first is direct observation, which is just as simple as it sounds. We go outside, we walk around, and we look for nuthatches, and we want to know what they're eating. This right here is a picture that I took, and there, was a lot of speculation on, what is it holding? We thought it could have been maybe half a peanut or a pupae of a moth or a butterfly. Alternatively, this could be like a piece of bark that the bird is using to like store food or something. The second thing that I've also dabbled in are field experiments. So this example here is an image taken from a camera trap using an experimental protocol that I developed, where we basically had a buffet-style feeding setup where we just had the seeds sitting out there and the different varieties separated, and we recorded which seeds were selected by the bird. This project is not a summary of those results, but we did find that white-breasted nuthatches were particularly savvy for sunflower hearts. So that's something to keep in mind for your own backyard views. The last method that I want to discuss, which is the focal point of this project, is the literature review. So really what this is just summarizing all the available published scientific data on a specific topic. In this case, we're looking at all the published scientific data on the diet of the white-breasted nuthatch. And this image here is really just a little piece of the master spreadsheet that I have for all the resources that I use. Okay. So, to start my literature review, I had an initial review of relevant literature, and I started with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology collection of resources called Birds of the World, which is about 155 references, and this was something that we all used as a group for CORAX. Then I searched various search engines using keywords such as white-breasted nuthatch, diet, foraging, etc., for things like Google Scholar. The next thing that I did was I looked for relevant resources in the cited literature of those papers that I found. So looking through all the papers that those papers cited and those papers cited. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, but let me just make sure this is. So finally, with all of that, I categorized all the diet items and the species in spreadsheet form. And just to be clear, this is not something that involves field work. It's mainly research and writing. So there were a lot of challenges with this process. The first is just simply a general lack of published information on this species, not even to the subspecies level, just the white-breasted nuthatch. There just isn't very much literature on it. And that effect is compounded when you look into the slender-billed subspecies, where there's just even less information. As an example of this, looking at the Birds of the World citations that I mentioned earlier, that collection of Cornell that they put together, various different authors and schools and whatnot. The white-breasted nuthatch has a total of around 155 citations, while the American robin, which is another common bird, you're getting close to 400. So more than twice that of the white-breasted nuthatch. So that should give some idea of the scale. And among these already scarce publications, even less had relevant information on diet. So most of them focused on other things like nesting, migration, and things like that. And additionally, out of those diet papers that were found, many of them were not very recent and had very small sample sizes. So out of 15 published resources that I deemed relevant enough to be reviewed, 7 papers included relevant diet information on the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch. The oldest paper was from 1926, and the newest was from 2019. So what this means is that, after the review that I just described, using search engines, going through the Birds of the World information, there were only 15 that really had any mention of diet or anything related to diet. And of those, 7 actually included diet information that was relevant. One other interesting thing is that only 3 of the 7 papers that included relevant diet information had data from the state of Oregon. And those 3 Oregon papers were the only papers which included data using birds that exist within the slender-billed range. So what that means is that there were probably only 3 diet papers that actually included the slender-billed subspecies. And through all these papers, diet items were named at various levels of classification, from all the way from the class level down to the species level. So here's kind of a visual summary of what we found. Just different groups of insects that this bird preys upon. The first being spiders, Araneda, also Lepidoptera, which is a big group of just butterflies and moths. We also have Coleoptera, which are beetles. This is an image of a weevil here, because weevils were primarily mentioned as one of the primary Coleoptera that were preyed upon. Dimoptera, which are earwigs, and Hemiptera, which are true bugs. So the other portion of this is plant matter. So what kind of seeds and berries do they consume? This is sort of broken up into two sort of like unofficial categories. The first three on the top here are sunflower seeds, corn, and wheat seeds. And what makes these interesting is that these are probably all introduced into the bird's diet by human beings. Sunflower seeds are primarily used in feeders. Corn can come from feeders or from local farms, and wheat seeds in their diet almost certainly came from farms. The bottom two here, Patagus, which is hawthorns, berries, and mast, which are acorns, are probably wild varieties that were found in their diet. And what's interesting about the hawthorn berries is that this is not a bird that is typically thought of as a fruit eater. So there's a lot of really interesting exploration to be done through that. So what do these results really mean? Well, the first thing is that the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch and, well, the white-breasted nuthatch in general feeds on a variety of insects, seeds, and fruits. What we're looking at here is just not a super narrow range of food items, but the specifics on the diet and the foraging behavior are still unclear because of what I mentioned about the lack of academic food sources. Generally, what this means is that more field studies are essential for understanding this bird's diet and its relationship with the organ white oak. And thus, they are essential for developing effective conservation strategies because, as I discussed earlier, this relationship is really, really important to conserving this species in the future. So I'd like to end with just a final note, which is kind of revisiting this picture that you saw earlier that I took, and we kind of hypothesized about what the diet of this bird is. Since I know I'm talking to a bunch of experienced birders, if any of you have any images or direct observations for your life, this nuthatch has something in its mouth. That's useful for all of us at the CORAX lab. So please do not hesitate to contact us with just anything at all that you might have of a nuthatch with something in its mouth. Lastly, I'd like to just quickly play some recordings of their calls and their songs so that those of you who are going to be out there birding will know what to listen for. So I hope this works over Zoom. Let's find out. So this is their call. Okay, so I'm sure to listen to that one. And this song here is very, very distinct and loud. So you will no doubt be hearing this at some point if you are out and about.
If folks aren't hearing that, it might be a bad link there, but Zena Kanto is a great website to go and find calls on. So some people may have got it.
Okay, well, sorry if that didn't work. But that concludes my presentation. I want to thank everyone at CORAX and Professor David Craig for supporting this project and making this research possible.
Thank you, Blake. One thing's term that Blake was using was the CORAX. The CORAX is Craig's Outstanding Research Associates in the X Factor, which could be anything. So we're definitely a team. Sometimes it's Craig's Outstanding Research. Often it's also a community of research associates in the X Factor. Great. Next, we have more insights about the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch, and Caden Cantrell will share what we have. we have a little more information than we do with diet, but there's still lots to know. Kaden, the Zoom universe is yours.
Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yes, okay, excellent. I will be talking about a very unusually low to the ground nest that our research team found over the summer, last summer at the Zena campus, which is our big forest farmland that the university owns. So Blake just told you a lot about wave-breasted nuthatches, and I'm sure you already know all about them. But what I'm going to be focusing on is the fact that they are secondary cavity nesters, and they tend to nest within deciduous forested areas, including Zena or the park or your backyard. So when we're talking about the pros and cons of a cavity nest, the pros are usually that it's mostly permanent unless the tree falls down or is otherwise damaged. Protection from the elements is pretty much the major one, and protection from predators most of the time is also a pro. And the cons are that, especially if you're a secondary cavity nester, there can be very limited nest availability. And the single entrance to the nest definitely limits, kind of an escape route if a predator is trying to get into the nest. But otherwise, they are pretty protected. And so I also completed a literature review, a very similar procedure to Blake. I started out with the Birds of the World citations, and in those, most of the data was focused around these 4 groups of nuthatches, which are the white-breasted nuthatch, red-breasted, pygmy, and Eurasian. And they all have pretty similar nesting habits that are slightly different in some ways. Like, for example, the red-breasted and pygmy nuthatches do have the ability to create their own cavities within snags or dead trees. So they can do primary or secondary cavity nesting, and they all have slightly different height preferences. The white-breasted nuthatch tends a little higher than the other species. And I have some pictures here. They also have different habits in terms of putting, like narrowing the entrance of the cavity with mud, or putting, red-breasted nuthatches will smear pitch around the entrance to discourage other birds from coming in, and you can kind of see it around the entrance there. Yes, but I have conducted a very extensive literature review on the 150 Bird of the World citations, and then some other ones through our library database for Google Scholar, as well as citations of the citations in those papers. So I did like a first run through to see if they actually had any information about nuthatch nesting, and then went through again and recorded literally anything that I could about any specific height measurements or the species of tree that the nest was found in. And sometimes, especially for the older papers, they would be like, it's a big tree, or the hole is too small to fit my hand in. But I recorded that anyways, just to get like a general idea of the size and height and location of all the nests that have been recorded. So I was able to gather information on almost 400 nests over 15 different sources, the first of which was from 1924, and the latest was from 2004. And the majority of the information was collected in the 1960s and 70s. There's like a pretty good chunk of studies that came from the 20s and 30s, and then there was a student at Oregon State University who did a thesis on nuthatches and had a huge nest survey that had some really great data for me to look at. But the majority of them came from the 70s, which again, like Blake said, there's kind of an issue with there's like not that much recent data on nuthatch nesting, especially when it comes to the slender-billed nuthatches. And so through my literature review, I calculated the average nest height across the US and Canada to be 4 meters, which is interesting because if we went back to this slide, that's a little bit under what the Audubon website actually reports as the average height. But if we want to look at this data table I put together, you can kind of see that a lot of the times these studies were just reporting on one nest that they had found. And so I think that the measurements of individual nests tend to skew lower because it's what people can observe easier. Like it's really hard to see exactly what's going on with a nest that's 12 meters up in a tree. When people do these like comprehensive reviews, the average height tends higher, but then when it's like just a few nests, it tends lower. And because most of the studies published are on just a few nests that people, you know, anecdotally were able to collect data on, the average that I calculated does skew a little lower. But the average nest height for specifically slender-billed nuthatches was a lot closer to 6 meters. So even within white-breasted nuthatches as a whole, our local subspecies do actually tend to go for a little bit higher nest. And throughout, I had concrete measurements for about 160 nests, almost 70 of which were specifically for white-breasted nuthatches. And those are the ones in bold up here, but we don't have to worry about that too much. The thing that I really want to draw your attention to is this nest, which doesn't have a specific date because they didn't mention it, but it was from a study that was published in the 30s. So we can assume it was located in the 20s or 30s, like most of the other nests from that study. And it is at 1.1 meters is the lowest one on record for the slender-billed nuthatch that has been published. However, the nest that we found at Zena was only a 1/4 of a meter above the ground, and I'll get into more of the specific measurements in my next slide, but that means that it was almost 4 meters shorter than the average height, and then 5.75 meters shorter than the average height for slender-billed, which it was a mated pair of slender-billed nuthatches. And it's, you know, 3/4 of a meter shorter than the previously lowest nest that had been found in Oregon, which is super cool. And so this is the tree and one of the nuthatches. And then you can, this is the best picture I have. I sat there for half an hour trying to get a really good picture of them going into the nest. And you can kind of see it right here. It's at the very base of the tree trunk. This is our little camera trap that we had set up. And you can see the nuthatch heading in there. And so we went back a few weeks in a row to come look at this nest. And once they had moved on, oopsie, okay, we were able to get some pictures and measurements. And so it's basically 24 centimeters or like 1/4 of a meter above the ground. And then it's set a little bit into the tree. So there's like this outer divot part of the tree, and then the actual chamber itself is about 4 by 4 centimeters. And then it went and into the tree about 10 centimeters and had an overall depth of around 30 because it sort of curved downwards, but we can't really see in there very well yet. I hope to get a camera in there sometime soon, but from what we could tell, it was sort of like just a little tunnel that went into the base of the tree down here. And Dave loves to tell the story about how we found this nest because it makes him look really good for hiring people who don't know anything about birds. Because my co-researcher Janet actually found this nest because the parent birds were actively bringing food into it, and she was like, I think there's a nest in the ground down there. And Dave was like, no, that's not possible. They don't nest in the ground. Like, what are you guys talking about? But it turns out it was just very low down in the tree, and we might not have found it if we knew anything about nuthatches. So it was very exciting for everybody. And so we put up a camera trap, and we managed to catch a picture of this flying squirrel, which I feel like is a great example of the major risk of having a nest that's low to the ground, which is that there is definitely an increased risk of predation, especially by ground predators that wouldn't normally be able to reach a cavity nest, including snakes. Because usually when you're a cavity nesting bird, you only really have to worry about other birds or squirrels. And I think that the risk of predation from other birds is probably about the same, maybe even lower if the nest is still low to the ground. But the risk of predation from ground predators is definitely much higher. However, despite this very much increased risk, the nest was successful because we found it originally because the young had already hatched and were being fed, and we went back, a few weeks after and they were still there, and then eventually they were gone and there was no evidence of nest failure, so we can assume that they all fledged successfully, which is great. And so my two main explanations for why they chose this nest that was so low to the ground was probably due both to cavity availability and like the ideal neighborhood for like the habitat that they were in. So we did observe another mated pair of nuthatches pretty close by that tree, and they tend to be pretty territorial, and so I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a limited range that they had to choose a cavity, and that ended up maybe being the best option because there weren't even any other cavities in the tree that would have worked. Or it also possibly could have been that they already had a nest in the area, that the tree was damaged or came down and they were forced to move to a sort of subpar cavity location. I mean, it worked out for them, but what the literature would consider as a very unusual place to have a nest. But it seemed like they had adequate food resources and it was not difficult to reach, so it worked out for them. Yeah, and so in the future, I do hope to get some imaging of the inside of the nest to see what's happening in there and how big it really is, and if there are any nest contents left over. And I think it'd be really great to try to go back and monitor the nest again this year to see if they return, because they did have a successful nest, and they could come back and try again. And I also think that doing sort of an inventory of the total cavities in the area to see if that really was limited availability. If there's no other cavities in the area, then we probably know that it's because it was the only one there. But if there are a lot of other cavities, then you kind of have to ask again, like, why did they pick that one that was so low? And I also think it would be interesting to do some territory mapping, especially of that pair, but also of any surrounding ones that we can find, to sort of determine where the boundaries of that territory are. Yeah, and thank you to Dr. David Craig and my summer research team and our research team this semester. Yeah, and then I have a question slide, but we will get to that later.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaten. Thanks, Gaten, and thanks especially for inviting everybody. If you've got nuthatches nesting in your yard this year, the CORAX team is really keen to learn about that spot and those places. So we'll encourage that. Our last talk today, before we do questions, is from Patrick Livingston, and they're going to talk about nesting kestrels, and which has got these great connections to the Audubon chapter, and then special thanks to Ray Temple and Stephanie Hazen who supported this project. I know Patrick will say that too, but I wanted to throw my gratitude in there as well.
Sorry, everybody. I skipped the title slide, trying to unmute myself. But I am Patrick Livingston. I'm a senior at Willamette University, and I will be presenting my monitoring and management plan for American Kestrels in the Willamette Valley, specifically in the Conservation Easement that is Willamette's property of Zena Forest Farms. And so this first slide I want to show you guys is just kind of basically about the American Kestrel. If you look on the right side, I have two pictures of kestrels. The one on the left is a male and the one on the right is the female. And kestrels are super cool because they're very easily identifiable of their sex by the markings on their feathers. The male has slate blue wings and a dark bar on the end of its tail, and the female has black barring on its whole body and no slate blue on its wings, but on the top of its head. And if you look over to the left, I have a range map for American kestrels. You can see that they're mostly permanent residents throughout most of the US, but in the northern US, it gets a little cold, so they have to migrate south for the winter. And the further north that they live, like in Alaska, the further south they have to migrate, because you can see that in the blue area is the non-breeding residence. So it's a really long flight from Alaska for a lot of kestrels. And yeah, so in warm locations, egg laying can begin as early as March. And in cooler locations, it normally begins in April. And if kestrels fail to have a first nesting attempt, they can attempt a second nesting, but will most likely move cavities. And yeah, so males tend to arrive to the nesting sites first at the end of kind of winter in December, and they scout out the nesting territory by looking at hunting grounds and seeing which hunting ground has the best nesting cavities. And then the females will arrive later, and the male kestrels will show them the hunting grounds and the nesting cavities that they found. And if the females find the nesting cavities attractive, then they will breed and hopefully fledge some young. Yeah, and so kestrels from different parts of North America have different migration strategies. And this is something that the American Kestrel Partnership, which is an organization that I'll talk about later, uses to hypothesize about why the kestrel population is declining the way it is. And so, yeah, if you look on the right here, I have a bunch of graphs. The most important part of these graphs are the color and the direction the graphs are going. So at the top, you can see two that are in red, and they're trending down of the number of kestrels per survey route. And so that means the population's decreasing in those areas. And then you have yellow in the middle where there's no statistical change of the population. And at the bottom, you have green, which signifies an increase in population. And then if you look over at the map on the left, you can see that the colors correspond to the graphs. And so it's interesting as well that most of the kestrels that are in the northern parts of America are doing worse than the kestrels that are in the southern parts, because the kestrels that are more northerly have to migrate further, and that is one of the hypotheses as to why their population is declining the way it is. So yeah, my area of study is going to be in the Zena property, which is in the bird conservation region number 5 over here, which you can see is in decline. And so I want to figure out why it's in decline and hopefully map the number of kestrels that I could see in this specific survey route that I developed. Yeah, and so this green outline here is the Zena Forest Complex. And then the filled in green is the conservation easement. That's 305 acres that Willamette owns. And then, yeah, this red line is my survey route, and it comes out of West Salem. And then Willamette University is down here. And yeah, so just want to outline Kestrel Habitat a little bit. Like the white-breasted nuthatches, American kestrels are second cavity nesters, which means that they don't make their own nests. They're quite adaptable in terms of temperature and environment, which you could see from the range map earlier, that they're pretty much spread across the entire US. Hunting territory is a really important factor of a good nest. Baby birds get a majority of their water source from food that their parent acquires from hunting, and so it's very important that there's ample food and hunting territory for a good kestrel nest. And mostly what kestrels like to hunt in is like shortgrass prairies, farmland, like tall grass, anything that they can see rodents running around in. And if you look at this picture down on the bottom left, this is really exemplar good territory for kestrels. You can see this tree line in the middle, which is where they like to make their nests on the edge of the tree line, so that they feel protected on their back and they're overlooking their hunting territory in front of them. And yeah, and so here's an example of a bad nest. It's sitting right in the middle of a dense forest, and you've got an unhappy kestrel here on the right because he doesn't want to nest in there. And yeah, the placement of nesting boxes is really important because if they're placed poorly, kestrels could possibly try to nest in them and it could result in failure, and that pair of kestrels could possibly not be able to produce any young that season, which is pretty unfortunate because of population decline they're experiencing. And it's really important for us to put up nest boxes, which is what I'll talk about a little bit later, because of a tree snag decline. Tree snags are basically, I'm sure you guys know this, but they're like dead trees that have natural cavities in them. And so they're very useful for nesting. And they've been declining because of lumber reasons, and people don't like them aesthetically a lot of the times, and it's pretty sad. So that's why putting up nest boxes is super important. And yeah, I'll be talking about Zena as my model environment for a number of reasons. It's available to me through the Willamette University, and so it's a really cool place to study a lot of natural habitat and wildlife. B, in 2018, a pair of kestrels nested on the Zena house that's right by the road. And there was a northern flicker drilled a hole in the side of the roof, and they started nesting in there. And sadly, we had to fill in the hole because they would wreck the inside of the house. But I put up a box on the side of the house. So hopefully those same pair of kestrels will come and nest here again. In the picture on the right, you can see this is a picture taken looking out from one of the boxes that I installed. And it's super good hunting territory, plenty of tall grass for kestrels to look around for rodents in. And yeah. Now I'll talk about kind of what I've been doing to manage kestrel populations. And so this is, these are the nest boxes that I created with the help of Ray Temple. He showed me his design, and I'm very thankful. But yeah, some of the most important features here are the hinges open up from the bottom so that when you're opening it, you can make sure that no baby birds or eggs fall out, because you can see if they're leaning against the door instead of just opening it up and having them fall out. There's some ventilation holes on the bottom, which are super important. Also on the side, for if it gets really hot in the summer, don't want the birds to get too hot. Another important feature is the hole. You need it to be big enough for the kestrels to fit through. And yeah, here I am installing the boxes with the help of David Craig. He's the one taking the pictures here. And yeah, so these are two of the locations that I chose. One of them is an old oak tree, and one of them is the side of the Willamette Zena house. And yeah, in this slide, you can see all the three locations that I chose. And if you look at the map on the right, these little houses correspond respectively to the pictures on the left. And so Kestrel 1 is this box, Kestrel 2 is this box, and 3 is this one. And so for the one on the left, I chose a pretty isolated spot on the top of a hill overlooking a little field, and it's facing southwest, which is the literature value that says kestrels most prefer. The box on the house is also facing south, but the one on Kestrel 3 is facing northeast. And I chose northeast because I wanted to see if kestrels actually preferred south or if it was simply a matter of preference. And for two of the boxes, I installed them 10 feet above the ground, and on the one on the house, I installed about 20 feet above the ground. Yeah, it says to install them at least 20 or 10 feet above the ground. And yeah, so here's a slide showing some nest intruders that could be nesting in the boxes that aren't American kestrels. The ones on the left over here, we got European starlings and house sparrows. And they're both invasive, so they should be removed from the boxes if they're found. And on the right, we have screech owls and tree swallows. Both of them are native species and should be allowed to nest in the boxes. And yeah, on this slide, I have a little about maintenance. Every year prior to nesting, boxes should be cleaned because parasites like ticks can stay in the nesting material and infect the next year's residents, so they should be clean. And then removal of invasive nesters is important to leave room for kestrels. And then if boxes are not occupied within 5 years, they should be moved to more suitable locations, because that means the locations that I chose were not favorable to kestrels. Yeah, so this is the monitoring aspect of my project, where I developed a survey route to help map populations in Zena. So here I am on the top of the house using a borescope to look into the box, and sadly there were no kestrels in there, and there were no kestrels in any of the boxes that I have put up this season. So hopefully next season we get some residents, but even if they don't have residents, I still monitor them, and you should monitor them every 30 days starting when eggs are being laid. And so I monitored them 3 times over the past 3 months. And it's important to try not to scare the birds, and so you approach and leave quickly and quietly. Yeah, so this is the survey route that I developed. There's 15 total segments, and each segment's about 2 kilometers. So there's around 36 total kilometers of survey. And within the survey, I wanted to encapsulate a variety of different habitats, but I wanted all of the roads that my survey went along to have telephone poles, because those are the main form of perches that kestrels use when they're hunting. Yeah. And so here's a map that I made in QGIS to kind of help organize the data that I collected over my research. So I did the survey from the beginning of February to the end of April, and I went a total of 10 times. And each time I recorded the number of kestrels that I saw and the sex of the kestrels. And using the data that I found, I was able to locate 5 different pairs of kestrels, and those are shown by the pink dots on the map. And so the cross-hatched areas with the white and the green are occupied territories, and the hatched with just the green are unoccupied territories where I didn't see any kestrels. And the little triangles here are the nest boxes that I installed. So this is the Zena property up here. And I was able to find around 30,000 square miles of hunting territory contained within my survey route. And I described hunting territory as like farmland or shortgrass prairie. And around 23,000 square miles of that are currently being occupied by kestrel pairs. And so that leaves about 25% of the land unoccupied by kestrels, which could lead to putting up further boxes or hopefully nesting in the future. And yeah, so this is the American Kestrel Partnership. And this is their website on the right here with the picture. And this is where I got most of my data pertaining kestrels. They're the main organization that are mapping kestrel populations. And their research is looking at full cycle phenology, which is like the study of natural life cycles of an animal. And so like when they migrate or when they breed, and they're collaborating that with a Genoscape project on American Kestrels, which is trying to map out genetically distinct populations of kestrels across the US. And so they're trying to test their hypothesis that breeding populations of kestrels that are genetically distinct have different migration patterns, and that those different migration patterns have some sort of implication as to the population decline. And they were able to find 5 different distinct groups: Alaska, Western, Eastern, Texas, and Florida. And the populations that were further north they found were experiencing greater population decline. And then here's the website on the right. I logged all 3 of my boxes in there, but sadly I didn't have any kestrels, so the observations are still pending. But yeah. And then my conclusion. So some future research directions would be contacting Zena landowners to put boxes up on their property so that more kestrels could nest. And then working with the AKP further to monitor the boxes and put the data into the website so that it can be used. And then also extend the scope of the survey past just Zena and into different parts of the Willamette Valley. And yeah, this is just a little slide about kind of what I would like to do in the future. I'd love to work further with raptors because I find them very cool at a rehabilitation facility or a conservancy, and hopefully go to grad school and do research on raptors. And my research goals closely align with the AKP because I am very interested in genetics and I would like to help map population decline for different falcons. And yeah, my acknowledgements, I really want to thank Ray Temple and Stephanie Hazen for helping me design or helping me learn how to design a survey and giving me the design for the nest boxes and helping me make them, and David Craig for helping me realize my interest in raptors, and my CORAX crew for supporting me. Yeah, it's a question.
Thank you, Patrick. Great. Well, I just want to emphasize for those of you who've been part of Audubon for a while and seen some of these CORAX folks from Willamette speak, you've seen these beginning talks and you know some of the extraordinary careers that some of the people have as they come from here. So thank you so much for your attention. It really helps us focus our work knowing that there's going to be people that have some interest in it. And again, we really appreciate you collaborating with us as sort of first draft audience and all the great questions that you asked. There's been quite a few in the chat that have been going along that I've been answering. And I'll go through a few of those and kind of open it up and see what answers other folks on the team have. Maddy, what can you tell us about the seasonality of galls and how does that relate to how and when predation might be happening on the galls? And Caden, you might jump into where you've done work on this too. So question is, when can we see new galls, and then like the wasps and stuff in there, what should people be looking for and when should they be looking for this potential pattern?
In regards to galls, peak season of like development is usually around June, so in the summertime. But they develop throughout spring, and as they're developing, are kind of like small and green, and they slowly grow and become more of that brown, which is partly why we want to continue our research into the summer, to better see that relationship between bird predation and the galls.
Great. Caden, you did some similar preliminary work. Do you have anything to add about your sense of the interaction of birds and galls? Oh, Caden's outstanding in the moment. How about Patrick? There's questions about kestrels. How long will they stay on a territory when they're in a territory? Do you have any sense of that? Like somebody's got them in their area for 10 years in a row. Do you think those are the same kestrels, or do you think it could be different kestrels, or what do you know about their behavior?
Yeah, I think they're very likely the same kestrels. I think a lot of the kestrels that we see in the Willamette Valley are permanent residents here, and so they probably live here year round. And I would be surprised if it was a different pair if you see them at the same nesting site. Yeah.
Great. Let's see. And then there's a question: how would people get contact info for you, Patrick? I can put your email in the chat. Chris Shank is interested. For sure, anybody who is interested in sharing things that they're finding, or folks who may be seeing this on YouTube later on who aren't here tonight, you can get a hold of D as in David, P as in Peter, CRAIG, DP Craig at willamette.edu, or look up the Willamette access. And then sadly, I have a very active email thing, so I get lots of emails. So call 503-370-6333 if you don't get a reply back. So really are interested in these observations. Let's see. Caden, are you there? I lost track of you. Let's see, Caden. Blake, what was your biggest surprise in exploring the diet, and what recommendations do you have for people who want to understand nuthatch diet? Share a little bit about bird feeders, what some things that you know, and then elaborate a little more on diet.
Yeah, totally. The first thing I want to say is that diet is probably like one of the, if you all you have to do to observe diet is to walk outside and find the bird. So it's a very accessible thing. I think anybody can. You don't have to have a degree. You don't have to be a student. All you have to be is somebody with eyes and binoculars and maybe a camera. So as far as observing diet, anything, especially if it's a photo where you can have an observation of the bird holding something in its bill, is super helpful. I think probably the most surprising thing is kind of a funny story. Dave and I found this image of a bird with something in its mouth, and it was this red berry. And for months, we had no clue what it was. Especially since, like I did mention in my presentation, white-breasted nuthatches are not known as big fruit eaters. So we were just trying to figure out what it was. And through my literature review, I saw hawthorn listed as one of the food sources in one of the papers. And I looked up what hawthorn berries look like, and that was the berry that we saw in that Instagram photo like months ago. So that was probably the biggest surprise for me. It was just kind of finding that little coincidence. And through that, sort of learning about what fruits birds choose.
Great. There was a question that Tim asked about migration in white-breasted nuthatch, and I gave an answer. Does anybody have anything that they know that they want to add to? What's the story that we think that we know about white-breasted nuthatch?
We think that migration for white-breasted nuthatches is generally infrequent, and that they're majority residents. I think that there have been some big migrations that have documented, but they're not particularly seasonally migrating.
That's right.
Some populations are.
Yeah, and the migrations that have been observed are just on the East Coast in that subspecies, and just very recently through nighttime flight calls. And so there could be something happening. One of the things that Audubon has done, and Harry Fuller's been a really important contributor to, is the MODIS tower, the special tracking tower for understanding bird movements. And we're really keen to get some tags on white-breasted nuthatches and get insights into how sedentary or resident are they. Are they doing some special sneaky movements, or are birds coming in? So those are things we'll learn about hopefully in the future. I see thank you, Donna Bolt, who shares that they've got a pair of nuthatches in a funky 2-hole nest box for the 3rd year in a row in South Salem. We'll definitely come visit your yard, and I'll send you an email. So thanks for that. How has agricultural crop changes affected American kestrels? There's grass fields that are switching to hazelnut, other factors creating population pressures. What is that something you've learned about yet, Patrick? Sort of the way that landscape changes are happening in the Willamette Valley, or?
Not entirely, but I could definitely make some guesses. I would say that like having more shrubbery or shrubby bushes or agricultural crops over like grassy crops would decrease kind of the American Kestrel's ability to hunt in that range. And so it would make them less likely to return to that area and more likely to move locations, especially like with cutting down of trees and decline of tree snags. They wouldn't have as much of a area to nest in.
Great. Let's see if I'm missing any other questions. There's questions about what do kestrels eat?
Yeah, they eat mostly like large insects. They'll eat small rodents like rats and mice and voles and such. And you know, if they can't get their hands on any of that easier prey, they'll go for smaller birds like chickadees and such.
Great. And then for those that don't, I'll just add a little bit of detail about the place that we put the kestrel boxes up and some of the observations. The Zena property is a 305-acre mixed oak savanna woodland. Then also has a bunch of coniferous space, and so that's near the town of Zena, just 10 miles from downtown. Excellent. I think we've addressed most of the questions in the chat. There was one other observation that folks are seeing white-breasted nuthatches and minto along fairly commonly, and we are emphasizing the oaks as central to their natural history. It is also the case that they do use large black cottonwood trees and Oregon ash. Those sort of gallery forests are also used. The question that about what do they eat and does it relate to the slender bill and where do they nest and how does that relate? These are all other people other than us in the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have identified through the presence and absence of the white-breasted nuthatch throughout its range. And there's a high correlation with the places that Oregon oaks are, particularly large complex trees or oak woodlands. The birds are other places. And so the question is, how could we, if we lost most of our big old oaks, would we still have slender-billed nuthatches? We don't know. Would the cottonwood trees be enough for them? We don't know. I will share right now they're common in all the places that oaks are or ash trees. There's a new invasive pattern of the ash trees in North America are being threatened by the emerald ash borer. And we forecast we're going to lose most of our Oregon ash gallery forests in the next 30 to 50 years. And so good questions about what's going on at Minto. Let's see, some nice gratitude. Anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to ask? We want to make sure you can all have time to share your bird observations, and then undergraduates have lots of homework and they have more talks to do tomorrow, so we'll let them go. Let's see, have we been able to use the long ongoing raptor run routes and chart populations of kestrels and other raptors on the same routes from November through February for many years? Patrick, I think you joined, I think that's directed to you, Patrick. What do you know about it?
Yeah, for my research, I mostly use the data that I procured for my route. So no, I didn't use that data, but it could have been a good supplement to my research.
Yeah. We do a lot of driving out to the Zena property, and so Patrick developed a route, developed as a way for us to go and count kestrels every single time we drive to that property and do it in a year-round way. And it was definitely informed by the historic raptor route.
We have white-breasted nuthatches in our yard. And the interesting thing is that white-breasted nuthatches have used the same box, have been in that box for over 20 years. Of course, wow. They're not the same ones, but they're probably the same family just different generations. The same box. My husband had to repair it, but there it is.
All right.
And anybody's welcome to come look at it look at them if you want to.
We do, Judy. We're going to definitely come watch that. And you know what's interesting about a long-term nest like that is we'll be interested both in terms of the height of the nest and that you observed it for so many years in a row, and then your neighborhood, the sort of the quality of the trees in your neighborhood will be really interesting.
Right.
And
For scientific value, probably isn't good because we feed them. I mean, they're not like wild as they would be out at Zena. They're, you know, pampered and fed.
yeah, that's actually fascinating. So we have a interest in looking at the behavior across the sort of urban to rural to wild gradient. So
Right.
everything's scientifically interesting. Yeah.
And I just want to interject, Patrick and Kathy Patterson and John Matthews mentioned these raptor routes. My husband Bruce and I have the raptor route in North Polk County. And so we survey, you know, the area all around this Zena forest. It's a 130 mile raptor route. And so we've kept track of kestrel numbers for the last 15 years. I didn't know if you would want any of that data. And you can see from the raptor route exactly the roads that we've seen the kestrels on. And you can see that although we're, you know, seeing the pairs of kestrels on the wires, we don't know what territory they're particularly nesting in, like your research is doing.
I would love that. Yeah.
Honestly. Okay.
I put my email in the chat. That'd be
I know
very
you
fascinating data to look at.
I didn't get your email information. So.
If you just, I think if you open the chat, you should be able to see it. But let me know if you can't.
Right now.
Yeah, it's there. I saw it.
Okay. Leave it up for a minute and I'll copy it down.
So other attendees, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question directly, feel free to do that. The other thing, Patrick, we've been doing Christmas bird counts here in the Salem area for 50 plus years. And as you probably know, Audubon Cornell has quite a database on that data. You can go in there and get normalized frequencies normalized by party hour. It gives you a pretty good idea about trends in particular species. So that's locally. I haven't been able to aggregate that, but I think you can get the data directly and aggregate it for larger areas, but at least that'd be winter populations. And since the kestrel, I don't think migrates much, it would look at overall populations. I have looked at the raptor numbers for Salem, and it doesn't appear that they're declining here in Salem, looking at the normalized data, but I haven't looked broader than just our circle, our 15 mile diameter radius circle.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to look at. I'd love to see data for raptors over multiple years, especially kestrels. Is that data on the website?
Yeah, if you do a web search on Christmas bird count, it will take you to the national page, and then there is a link there for the count results. And all you need then is just the code for each count. For Salem, it's ORSA is the code, ORSA. And then you just put in the date ranges. And the nice thing is then it will give you that normalized data over any period of time you care to look.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'll look at that.
I should mention that Patrick does have a passion for raptors, but we were trying to make a project that he could climb stuff. He's a big climber. So really an excuse to climb trees and sides of buildings and cliffs. So that was sort of an entry point. And then this is great how it's opening up into so many other kinds of ways that they can get data. So.
So
Great.
Judy talked about loyalty of nest boxes for particular white-breasted nuthatches. Is that true for kestrels too? Do they, if they select a nest box, would they tend to go back to that same nest box year after year? Those adult are they paired for life, and would they go back to that same nest box, do you think?
Yeah, they are. And I think that if the nest box was successful, that they would definitely go back to the same nest box. But I think that if it was a nest box that foresaw problems and had issues, they would probably try to move it.
Well, I think, Tim, should we thank David and his students? They've done a great job tonight. It's been very fascinating stuff.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. That's
Yeah,
great.
thank
you.
Well, thank you very much.
It was greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Our pleasure. And we hope we were doing our talks in person tomorrow on campus, and had we known the world was where it was, we'd love to see everybody in person, and hopefully if we get invited back next year, we'll see everybody in the real world.
Thanks for the
Great, thank you.
invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So do we want to see if people want to do some sharing?